Oops, I think you're still muted,
I'll
Dekila.
try. Did that work? Okay. All right. Kuzampo and Tashitile, everybody. I'm so happy to join you all. I like to use slides because I always feel like that way I can capture the work of what everyone is doing around the world. And also, I think in some sense, provide meditative support for everybody that's listening. And honestly also provides some discipline for myself because I tend to go off in tangents. So for all of these reasons, I'm going to share some slides. And at the same time, I really encourage people to drop questions, even if you're in YouTube. I believe Noah's going to help me manage those. If there are any questions, we'll try to tack it on to the end. So when I created the title for this talk, I've been lately really ruminating a great deal about where my own resilience comes from doing the work I do on environmental and climate issues. It's a question I get asked all the time. And in the last year and a half, I've sort of realized that a lot of it comes from being part of a family and a community of female practitioners, and how over the years, it's that relationship, the relationship with mother wisdom and Prajna Paramita, and sort of the reliance I have had since I was a child on the maternal aspect of the Buddha, is actually the source of my resilience. So this was the plan. My plan was to give a talk on mother wisdom. But when Noah did the introduction, it suddenly hit me that actually the plan went a little awry. And what I'm planning to talk a little bit more about is not just mother wisdom, but also the essence of water. And listening to my own bio, I was reminded that actually I got into environmental work because of water, because I was so concerned about the damage hydropower development was having in my own community in Sikkim. So it all seems to come together one way or the other. It always comes together. I wanted to start by acknowledging the lands where I live now, which is in Madison, Wisconsin. These are the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people. North of me are the Menominee people, and then north of them are the Ojibwe people. And, I'm sure you've heard and sat through and developed so many land acknowledgements yourself. The reason why I want to do this is because I really want to highlight two things. One is that the land that I live in is the land of sacred lakes. We're surrounded by water everywhere we go. There's just thousands of lakes up north. This is the land that the Ho-Chunk people were forced to cede in 1832, and then sort of had to go through ethnic cleansing and resettlement. The second thing I really want to acknowledge is that the Loka Initiative, when I realized I was creating this program here at UW-Madison, being Bhutia, as Noah mentioned, from Sikkim, my first instinct was to actually go to elders in the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee nations and to introduce myself as an indigenous child from elsewhere, as an indigenous person that is beloved by the land elsewhere. And so from the very beginning, the Loka Initiative, we have advisors from the Ho-Chunk Nation and the Menominee Nation, and they have helped guide our way, and they have helped develop some of the programs that I will mention is in my talk. And I want to stress this because I feel like there is something about the capitalist neoliberal world that we are in where it takes the best of our intentions and turns it into a completely transactional thing. So it's really easy to take something like land acknowledgement and just make it transactional, as opposed to what it really means, which is we are acknowledging the people who are alive today in these lands and thinking of ways to give back and work with them. And so I express all of this in an invitation that for those of you who are interested in it, that you may also want to do the same thing. And then I want to take a moment to acknowledge my sacred land of origin, which is Sikkim. What you are looking at is Mount Kanchenjunga. For those of you who've listened to me before, you know what I'm going to say. Most of you probably have never heard of this mountain. He is the third tallest peak on the planet. And so it might be surprising that you haven't heard of him. But there is a reason why, and it's because the Bhutia people, the Lepcha people, and the Tsong and the Limbu, who are indigenous to this region, we refuse to let him be climbed. We have had all kinds of lucrative offers, from all around the world, mountain climbing expeditions, pressure from the central government, pressure from the private sector. And we've held steadfast because he is alive and living to us. He is the protective deity of Sikkim. And because we have held steadfast, it has meant that this area's biodiversity has been preserved all these decades. Despite all the pressures of development, we've managed to hold that back. When we talk about balance, when we talk about the way we live on the planet being unsustainable, I feel like we have to articulate very clearly the debt we have to Indigenous peoples, because 80% of biodiversity exists on Indigenous managed lands. And the reason why it exists there is because Indigenous people put their bodies on the line all the time to protect their landscapes, because nature is alive to us. And so this is really not just a conceptual ethos, right? This is lived. And when we see protests, if for those of us who are in North America, when we see protests happening around the Dakota pipeline or Line 3 or Line 6 or any of these things, what we have to see is that these are climate change protests, and that the Indigenous elders who are there and the Indigenous people who are leading these protests are doing it partly as climate activism. And I feel like there is a tendency to really split that and not see that as part of the larger environmental movement. So I grew up somewhere in the middle here. I grew up in Sikkim in the Eastern Himalayas. And the reason why I wanted to show this map was to show what mainland Asia owes to the Tibetan Plateau. So what you see basically are all the major rivers that emerge, are born in the Tibetan Plateau. So, going, I guess, from my left to my right, you have the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Irrawaddy, the Salween, the Mekong, the Yangtze, and the Yellow Rivers. We're talking about almost 2 billion people that live in these watersheds. So when we talk about climate change, when we talk about something like, global temperatures are rising, right? Glaciers are melting. When it happens here in this area, it actually ends up impacting over 1 billion people. And I say this to kind of bring up how we culturally, when we talk about Tibetan people, we imagine them in this really dry, arid place, right? When we think about global warming, we have very specific ideas of what they mean. But because we're all interdependent, because we are part of an ecosystem, everything affects everything else. So when the temperatures rise elsewhere in the world, and it's much higher in the Tibetan Plateau, what it means is actually flooding and droughts downstream, right? And so one of the things that's really beautiful about being an environmental scientist and being a Buddhist is that it's one and the same thing. I feel that all these years of studying ecology has meant that I've been studying Buddhism all along. And all these years of practicing Buddhism has meant that I've been studying ecology all along. So some of what I present to you will feel really natural because that is part of the Buddhist worldview. And some of it, I hope, will be activating for those of you who are not activated on climate change. This has been a really difficult couple of years for all of us. All of us have suffered. When I saw this headline, somebody sent me this headline, actually. Somebody took this photo and sent it to me. And this came out last year. And somebody said, well, your job is done. And it was kind of a joke, right? That the New York Times finally had this headline which said climate change is here and everybody should be panicking. And this is something we really should be worried about. And it was written by Samini Sen-Gupta, who's a great environmental writer. And I remember feeling actually acute despair when I saw this headline, because it felt like, okay, finally, people are waking up to climate change. And they are waking up to climate change for all the wrong reasons, right? They're waking up to climate change because all of a sudden, the message has arrived that it's going to affect the affluent countries. The message has arrived that affluent people are not safe. The message has arrived that economies are going to collapse because of climate change. And I was just like, of course, saw the opportunity there, but it's also such a point of despair that that's what it's taken to wake the West up, to wake the global North up. Because of course, we know what's been happening everywhere else. Just this summer, We are, the planet is in crisis. You look at the Yangtze River, we know what's happening in the Yangtze River, right? And the amazing thing is it's not simply climate change, which is happening at a global conceptual level. It also is because of terrible governance, as it happens partly because of the Three Gorges Dam, right? Because all of this time, governments have convinced themselves that they can manage and they can run nature as they wish, and nature actually is impossible to tame. So here we are in a world-breaking drought for China, right? World-breaking flood for Pakistan. 1/3 of the country is underwater. We're talking about 33 million people who are displaced, who are now homeless, just like that within 2 months' time. And Jackson, Mississippi, right, where all of a sudden there is no usable water, no water coming from the taps. And so going back to that headlines, I think one of the things that I really struggle with is that while climate change has arrived, affluent people will always find ways to protect themselves. Because the city that is most impacted right now, the city in the headlines, 80% of Jackson is Black, right? It's countries in the global South that are really suffering and struggling with no ways of mitigating the impact at all. I'm not putting aside the 45 million people in the West that are right now really suffering because of the heat waves, but I thought how incredible it is that water, this planet that is made up 75% of water, that water is the thing that's tying all of these climate change impacts together. Either too much of it, too little of it, right? Not enough to drink it, not safe to drink. So what does that mean for those of us who are Buddhists? What does that mean for Buddhism when we are seeing a planet in crisis and we are seeing suffering writ large that is only going to grow among human and non-human living beings? What does that mean for us? Going back to some of the lessons I've learned, I think one thing I really want to emphasize at this point is that yes, it is caused by humans. Climate change is caused by humans, but that does not mean it is specifically your fault. And that so much of the climate messaging has been to blame the individual, right? So much of the messaging has been, if you only recycled, if you had only, biked instead of driven. And we have been trained to really absorb that guilt on an individual level. We have been trained to point our fingers individually at others to say, well, are you vegan? Are you vegetarian? Aren't you flying, right? Like that kind of judgmentalism has only grown with the environmental movement. And I think we have to pause and say for a second, it's not the individuals that is problematic. It is not 99% of the world population that caused climate change, right? It is the system. What do I mean when I say the system? I really mean neoliberalism and the economic system that exists around us. When we walk into a store, this is my favorite example because this overwhelms me every time. When we walk into a grocery store and we look at all the diversity that exists in that grocery store, we look at all the cereal brands, the wheat that exists, the types of bread, the kinds of bread, the names of the bread, all of that. Our assumption is this is great diversity that is meeting the needs of all of us. And the reality is that grocery store is owned by 10 companies. All of that diversity is fabricated. That is neoliberalism, basically. Neoliberalism is capitalism on steroids. It's basically capitalism with no checks and balances, no governments, no watchdogs, right? No regulations on how trade flows. And it has been happening for the last 50 years. We are finally at the point where we are seeing the impact of these systems. There is a natural tendency for Buddhists, including me and my family, to want to just, focus on the things we love, contemplate, do our practices, go into quiet spaces, do our meditation, pray for everybody, right? So when I talk about these issues, I sometimes feel like I'm letting a wild tiger into the room because people get so overwhelmed and a little terrified when I'm coming and saying, well, what do we do with this system? The system that we individually did not create, but we inherited. And unfortunately, that we are complicit in keeping alive, right? For anyone who buys anything on this planet, we are unfortunately involved in this system. And I think it's really really worth saying that the solution lies in what we love to do. The solution lies partly in contemplation, partly in our practices, because that gives us the inner resilience we need, and partly in the communities we've created. So I did not plan to work with faith leaders at all. This was nowhere in my plan when I started studying environmental science, right? I was trained in a really traditional environmental science way. I went to work for the World Wildlife Fund. I was successful at what I did. I was good at what I did, and I took a lot of pride in doing good conservation work. And what happened was I could not sleep at night. And somewhere in the mid-2000s, I started having panic attacks, terrible panic attacks. I would have nightmares. A lot of what I was seeing around me, which was, spending a great deal of time modeling what climate change was going to bring to the Mekong region, the amount of livelihoods that would be destroyed, people's lives, species, forests, all of that, right? It was showing up in my dreams. And for a long time, I thought I was the only one. It is something, in the environmental world, we are taught to feel shame because what we assume is happening is we're not tough enough. And so what we assume is happening is a burnout. But I remember I had this moment where I decided to tell one of my colleagues what I was experiencing. And he said, "Oh, me too," for many years. And so my curiosity kicked in and I began asking how many people in my office were experiencing this. And it turned out every single person was. And before I knew it, that had become this informal questionnaire. And everyone was responding to me saying that they were experiencing basically signs of PTSD. Now, I was really lucky because I happened to have a meeting with His Holiness the Karmapa and ended up creating environmental guidelines for Tibetan Buddhist monastics. And the work that I did with the monks and the nuns in the Himalayas was so energizing and so inspiring because they immediately got it. They immediately understood what the crisis was and wanted to act. And it ended up catapulting me into this faith-based work. And that's what I've done ever since 2008. And so when people ask me, why do I work with religions? This is usually what I put in front of them, right? Very transactional reasons. 85% of the planet follows a spiritual path. 80% of biodiversity is in indigenous managed lands. Faiths together are one of the wealthiest category of financial investors. They run 50% of all schools worldwide. Just take the Catholic Church alone. It's the third wealthiest property owner in the world. So there are all these reasons, like economic reasons for why anyone would work with faith leaders, and people often ask me, well, what do you do that is tangible, right? Like, what do faith leaders do that is tangible? And one of the best examples for me has been to give this example, which is the fossil fuel divestment movement. And we know that faith communities together make up 1/3 of fossil fuels all around the world. So faith communities have had an enormous impact collectively when it comes to climate change. But of course, there is a much deeper reason why I began working with faith leaders. I'm the daughter of a faith leader. I knew very early on that not only was my own inner being a spiritual kind of alive being, right? That it was, that whatever I did was an embodiment of my spiritual values. There was also this deeper sense of awareness that, that I had a purpose. And that part of my purpose was spiritual. And for those of you who I can see in the Zendo, I know you feel exactly how I feel, which is when you have spiritual purpose, what that means, the kind of responsibility you voluntarily take on, right? And so working with faith leaders was really natural for me, and I'm just extremely grateful I get to do this. When I got to launch the Loka Initiative here at UW-Madison, I did it in partnership with Richie Davidson and John Dunn, many of whom you know, both of whom many of you know. And from the very beginning, what I was able to do, because it was a community of faith and indigenous leaders, was to say that we need to create a vision where the inner community and planetary well-being are interdependent. We need to create a vision where we get to say all three of these things matter. And we're not taking only one of these things as a priority, but that we prioritize all three. So the vision for Loka is that inner community and planetary resilience are interdependent. You cannot achieve any one of these things without working on the other two. And what that has meant is that Loka gets to do capacity building with faith leaders and indigenous leaders. We get to develop research. We get to create courses for faith communities. And we get to do a lot of public engagement and outreach. I say all of this partly to get it out of the way so I can talk about the embodiment of interdependence, which is what I really am excited about, right? But one of the things I do want to say is that the reason why I decided to focus on capacity building so clearly with faith communities is because we often, when we join faith communities, we do so with the purest of intentions and the deepest of motivations. And we have a tendency very naturally, especially in Buddhism, to put our teachers on a pedestal, right? That is very natural. It's part of our practice. And I think sometimes what happens with that is that we tend to think of religious leaders as somehow being superior and not needing resources, not needing the same sources of resilience that other organizations need. And so in this work I've been doing now, I think almost for 15 years, what became really clear to me was the message I was receiving from faith leaders, which was that we need capacity, we need the training, we need people in our communities to be activated in the same way any other organization would be. And so that is what I have aimed for with the Loka Initiative. We work. Let me see if I put it. Great. So one of the criteria I used for working with faith leaders was who is not present at the UN Convention of Parties on Climate Change, who is not present at these global massive gatherings, right? And it became clear to me that the evangelicals were not present. And how necessary it is to have them engaged on climate change, because they are one of the most influential voting blocs when it comes to any issue in the United States. So the Loka Initiative, we partner with evangelical church leaders in the United States and around the world. We do a bunch of indoor, closed door conversations, dialogues, trainings, capacity building, you name it. We have a convening that's coming up that's in person that brings together 20 church leaders, mostly from the Midwest this fall. A lot of the work we do is very much around activating evangelical church leaders to claim climate change as a gospel issue and to work on climate change as sort of a mandate, as a God-given mandate. Another community, as I mentioned, that we serve are the indigenous elders in the Great Lakes, but also around the world. And so we did this event last year. It was indigenous centered, by which I mean we had only indigenous speakers and moderators, and it lasted for 3 days. We had 1,000 people show up for it, which was very unexpected. And what has emerged from it is a documentary that we're producing on indigenous resilience. And then the Tibetan Buddhist monastic community, this is the work that Noah had mentioned it briefly, that I helped create this association called Koryug, 50 monasteries and nunneries in the Himalayas, and they're still very active. And the last few years, the focus has been primarily on disaster management. So they do a lot of disaster cleanup, first aid. We have hundreds of monks and nuns that are trained to be first responders in the Himalayas. I say all of this to go through an example of what, our spiritual values can achieve. I feel like it's really easy for those of us who are called to serve and who are called to take care of others to feel overwhelmed by all the issues that are out there, right? There is no end to suffering. There is no end to the suffering that surrounds us. And so it's really easy for us to feel overwhelmed, give everything we can, and then burn out and be heartbroken. And so there has to be different ways of how I think we even do the service that we do. We have to think of different ways that we do it. And so in the last, I would say 3 or 4 years, what I've been spending a lot of time thinking about and working on is how do we embody interdependence? So this is interdependence. It's for us in Tibetan, Tendel is slightly different than what interdependence means, but I'll try. And to me, what that really comes down to is this very obvious truth, which is we all arise because of one another, right? We all exist because of one another. There is no way any of us would exist, for example, without the oxygen that is in our lungs right now. There is no way, right? And all of that oxygen actually comes from trees around us, from the plankton in the oceans, from the bushes that are outside, the plants in your house, all of that. So when it comes down to it, even our very breath comes from somewhere else. And the fact that we produce carbon when we breathe out, and that there are species that require it, especially plants. There is something in the design itself that is interdependent, isn't there? The scripture that when I was young, the scripture that my mother insisted I learn is Sherab Nyingpo, which some of you will know. It's the Heart Sutra. And the essence of it is Prajna Paramita, which you can see here. And she is often referred to as Mother Wisdom, because what Sherab Nyingpo is about is really, it's two lines, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. That's what it comes down to. And when we talk about interdependence for us, a lot of the interdependence that we are taught to meditate on is supposed to lead us to a very compassionate understanding of emptiness, right? We are never taught emptiness on its own. It always begins with interdependence. And when I talked earlier about the importance of merging ecological science and Buddhism, for me, these two things were so apparent that not only was interdependence the cellular basis of life, right? But that emptiness was also the cellular basis of life, because none of us could exist by itself. And I think at the end of the day, this has been the source of all the resilience that I could find within myself, and that I can offer to the faith leaders I work with, to the communities that surround me, and when I give talks, which is that we have to be able to walk with interdependence in one hand and this wisdom of emptiness in the other hand. And I say that for obvious reasons. When we are looking at issues like climate change, what becomes really, really apparent to us is impermanence, right? This is a saying that I heard Roshi Joan Halifax teach a few years ago, and it just really stayed with me, because this is, of course, something that makes a lot of people panic if we were to say this. Well, you're on this boat, the boat is going to sink. But for those of us who have, like I said, we're called, for those of us who actually were called to serve, we're called to ameliorate suffering, we're called to protect and to heal, this can also be a source of strength. This can also be a source of resilience. Because if we go in knowing this, we are better prepared than anybody else. The image on the right is what is called a bug out bag. And I thought I'll tell you the story of something that happened to me. So a lot of the training I did with the faith leaders, and especially in sort of, the late 2010s, was around disaster preparedness. And because I was living in California, it felt really personal to me, because, there were earthquakes happening all the time. You had to be really aware of where you were. We had wildfires and this constant fear of the 100-year tsunami that everyone's braced for in the West Coast, right? And of course, what I was experiencing was people's trauma, and trying to activate people through that trauma to be better prepared for whenever disaster strikes next. And so every time I came home from these training trips, what I would do is go through my own bug out bag. And a bug out bag is something that you have prepared expecting some kind of major tragedy or let's say a storm or an earthquake or some kind of epic disaster, right? Where you have to pick up everything that is important to you and leave. And so a bug out bag is that thing that helps you survive. It's your survival kit. So I would come home and I would just repack my bug out bag. And that ritual became something it was soothing for me. It made me feel as if in the process of doing that, I was packing my trauma away, right? I was kind of taking all this pain and this anxiety that I had and sort of able to process it and pack it away. And then lo and behold, an earthquake actually happened. And I had to pick the bug out bag. And it turned out I could not carry it. I had packed so much into this bug out bag, I could not lift the darn thing. And so here I am trying to go in the safe space that I've allocated with all my disaster preparedness training, told my spouse where I'll meet him and done all of that. I'm realizing that this bug out bag that is filled with all the things that I've decided are precious is actually way too heavy for me to take for more than even, I don't know, I barely made it out of the building. It was such a great lesson. It was such a fantastic teaching. It was a Dharma teaching, right? All that time that I spent kind of being attached to my trauma and being attached to my fear, I forgot that it was the attachment that was in that bag. That bag literally was the manifestation, the embodiment of all my attachment. And to have to leave it behind and keep going in a disaster was the greatest gift. It was as if like one of my teachers showed up and said, here is your practice for the rest of your life now, and so I think this realization that the boat is going to sink, and then this realization that it is our attachment that is holding us back. It is the attachment that is causing the suffering, right? I don't mean the original suffering. I mean the attachment to the suffering is the suffering itself, isn't it? And so that has been such a freeing experience that I have started offering it to all the Dharma communities I speak at, because this is the greatest lesson I think that working on disaster preparedness could have taught me. It is that in some sense, we have to let go of our own attachment to what we imagine are solutions, our own attachment to how we think we should show up as caretakers, our own attachment to what we imagine is the right way to solve a crisis. And the important part is to just show up. That is the essence of all the teachings that I've ever received, has been that the important part, when I say the embodiment of interdependence, the interdependence is actually not the most important part. It is the embodiment part. And just showing up is enough. We have such short lifespans as ourselves, This entity that's Dekila Chungyalpa is here for maybe at best another 30, 40 years, right? At best. And so it can be something that is so freeing as opposed to something that is frightening, right? That choice is available to us in itself, right here in front of us. We get this choice to say that this frees me rather than this fills me with fear. And I think when I was talking about these things that have brought me so much wisdom, being part of, learning environmental science has brought me so much Buddhist wisdom, and being a Buddhist practitioner has brought me so much ecological wisdom. These are the three things that I now end all my talks with, right? So here is the first one. The earth is a closed system. That means that you have the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the water, and the landscape, right? The land. When you look at Earth from space, what you see, this marble, nothing voluntarily enters it or leaves it. Maybe a few meteors, but nothing actually enters, exits, right? This is just perfectly there. Everything that is happening, our lives, the climate crisis, our communities, the Dharma communities we're creating, the people we love, the people we hate, the politicians we abhor, all of it is happening right here. We are constantly recycling into one another. In material terms, in spiritual terms, conceptually, in reality, we are just constantly recycling with one another. We cannot escape ourselves. right? So again, we have this wonderful joy of choice. We can either lean into that and embrace interdependence, or we can say we absolutely will continue to other everything and everyone on the planet and be extremely unhappy because we are going against this law of nature. I think the second part that has brought me great joy is that there are no boundaries once you're inside the ecosystem. There are no boundaries once you're within it. You know, there is no way to separate water from clouds. There is no way to separate rain from oxygen, right? There is no way for us to separate perfectly a terrestrial ecosystem from a hydro ecosystem. We are constantly merging into each other. There is no line that says, this is where Dekila begins and this is where oxygen ends, right? There is no point in my body where I can say, oh yeah, that's where I see the oxygen that came from external sources. And that's where I am, right? And so once again, what a great gift and joy that is. Once again, we get a choice. This is how we can show up, right? If we see that if we acknowledge that there are no boundaries, if we understand at a really conceptual level that there isn't a boundary between us and everything that surrounds us, well, what happens to everything else is important to us all of a sudden, isn't it? What happens in Pakistan is relevant to us, whether climate change came for the wealthy nations or not. For those of us who are here, who see that we're completely interdependent, it's one and the same thing, isn't it? And then finally, especially in nature, everything rests on something else. Every single thing. There is no species that you can pull out of its ecosystem and say it can exist alone. And there is no ecosystem that remains intact if you pull out any species from it. Everything rests on something else. And that, to me, is the essence of interdependence. You know, that is the essence of mother wisdom. When there is no form, right? When form is emptiness, when we are not able to say that this is self and this is other, but we are all self and we are all other, that essence of mother wisdom is what we need to build our inner resilience for what we do next. And so for those of you who are contemplating working on climate change and environmental issues, I hope that this helps. And I hope that this helps you find that sink of resilience within yourself to step forward and say that you will take on climate change, because it is causing so much suffering all around us all the time right now, right? It has not only caused so much suffering in the past, it will continue to do it in the future. And it is only going to get more extreme. There is no escaping it. And so I'll stop here. I don't know if we have time for questions, so I'm going to stop right here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dekila. There was just one question in YouTube, and if anybody has more questions, they can put it in now, although we're just about out of time. But someone asked, referring to your diagram, looks like the left side ego has a male figure on top as patriarchy, whereas the ego, the right side, is non-hierarchical, non-patriarchal. This is why we need feminine mother wisdom. Not really a question, but probably. I think
I love it. Yes, absolutely. I think the next talk is going to be very much about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see. It might be one more. Roshi Joan just says, "What a powerful talk!" And what a powerful talk! A powerful woman.
Roshi.
Dekila, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
The bug out bag Dharma. I love that. What do we take? What's our burden, and what can we put down, and what's really useful in our life?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope it's helpful. And for those of you who really want to work on environmental and climate issues, I encourage you to reach out. You can always find me.
Thank you, Dekila. We'll end with the 4 great Bodhisattva vows.
ends are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless.